Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Robbins. I'm one of the investors at GV. I also just recently finished my residency in psychiatry at Mass General. And joining us, we have three therapists who are from a blend of Quartet and Lyra, who will be answering a host of questions for us that have been asked from various people from the companies that are participating today, as well as folks at GV. And so I think we'll start by doing a round of intros, and then we'll jump right into the Q&A. Joe, do you want to give a brief intro?
Sure. I'm Joe Grosso. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm the director of clinical partnerships at Lyra Health.
Danielle?
Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Cottenham. I'm also a licensed psychologist in the state of California, and I am the clinical lead for Lyra's Blended Care and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program.
And Sherry.
Thanks, Ben. My name is Sherry Kirschenbaum, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and the clinical director at Quartet Health, which is a mental health technology company, making it easier for folks to get a mental health care.
So this first question is for Joe. So Joe, we're facing a lot of uncertainty these days, which I think for a lot of people is unsettling, maybe distressing for many people. Why is uncertainty so impactful to people's mental health?
Yeah, I relate to that personally and professionally. I think uncertainty is unsettling because uncertainty happens due to a lack of information about what's going to happen next and a lack of control. So it reminds us of our limited control, particularly around planning the future. And there are a few reasons for the negative mental health impacts with uncertainty. One is uncertainty leads to this underlying sense of vulnerability that results from our lack of control. And when people feel that vulnerability, it can manifest in different ways. It can make them more angry or frustrated, can make them more sad or helpless, and certainly it can cause anxiety. Another reason that uncertainty impacts our mental health has to do with how we respond to it. And sometimes we respond to uncertainty in ways that are very natural, but don't necessarily serve us well. So it's helpful to understand that our brains are wired to crave certainty and information about what's next. And in the absence of that information, our minds will try to fill in the blanks and often do that in the form of worry. So worry is our best attempt to create certainty where there is none by predicting the future. But as you probably experience for yourself, when we worry, we're thinking often in catastrophic terms or worst case scenarios about what might happen next. And so when we respond to uncertainty with worry, guess what? We feel more stress, we feel more anxiety because we're thinking in catastrophic ways. And so although worry can give us this illusion of control, the idea that, oh, I'm preparing myself for the worst case scenario, the trade-offs usually outweigh the benefits. And so worry just leads us to feel stressed and anxious while not usually helping us to prepare for likely scenarios in an effective way. That's why research shows that catching your worry thoughts early on, noticing them for what they are, just worry thoughts, and then redirecting your attention towards actions that actually are realistic in helping you, whether that's improving your self-care, prioritizing your mental health through the types of activities you engage in, or doing things to actually problem solve your situation. Those things are a lot more helpful than worry. And so to the extent that you can catch your worry early on, focus your attention on what actually is helpful and what you can control, it not only helps you to maybe problem solve the situation, but it can also help you to improve your mental health.
Danielle, maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more on that. There seems to be this interplay where people get worried about things that maybe are tangible, related to COVID, related to family issues, any host of things that are going on right now in our society. And that worry can lead to this more sort of abstract feeling of anxiety. Do you have any more tips? Maybe you could build a little bit on what Joe mentioned about how people can more effectively cope with anxiety.
Yeah, I think there's also one thing to be mindful of in terms of when we think about anxiety. So there's it is normal for humans to have a response. Like anxiety in and of itself is not an abnormal response. It's actually a very normal response. It's an adaptive one that tells us just from an evolutionary standpoint, like anxiety serves a function in terms of like fear and to be worried about what's happening. In terms of when anxiety and worry get to a point where it's impacting our functioning, where we're not functioning in a normal way, that's when we're more concerned about it. Because at that point, we're using anxiety and worry as an overestimation of the fear and what's actually going to occur. So kind of like what Joe highlighted is that it's this idea of focusing on the catastrophe or the worst possible scenario versus the more likely one, the one that's more probable possible. So I think it's also just to hold that like everybody probably experiences a bit of anxiety. In terms of when it becomes a disorder or a true mental health condition is really its impact on your functioning. Is it getting in the way of your ability to concentrate at work? Is it really impacting the quality of your relationships? Is it changing the way in which you're viewing yourself? Like you're kind of wondering, you feel really alone in this, that like, oh, I'm the only person who's having this type of anxiety. And then that makes you think like there's something wrong with you. Like there's something inherently messed up about the way that you are as a human. So I think when it's getting into those places of just really impacting your functioning, your relationships, the way you view yourself, at that point, it's becoming a condition with which you probably want to gain some more support and help around. Some things that I think could be also like helpful. So like Joe already mentioned about like just taking a different perspective and maybe thinking about things differently and shifting your perspective about things is one way to, I think, address the cognitive aspect of worry. So that overestimation of a situation. Anxiety also has in addition to like the emotional part of fear, it also has a behavioral component of just increase in heart rate. You may sweat, your palms get sweaty, you can't breathe, you feel very restless, you're very just like antsy and kind of like can't stay still. When those types of things are happening, there's lots of behavioral activities out there that people have referenced. So just some things about doing very intentional deep breathing, going for a run, like doing some type of exercises that can allow you to do something with this extra energy that you have versus just sitting there holding it, which only feeds that anxiety loop and only makes it more likely to occur. So it's really about trying to engage in some type of behavior that's going to break that cycle up a bit.
That's great advice. Sherry, I think a lot of people on this call are used to being high performers. They juggle responsibilities inside the home, in the office. Obviously, there's a lot of unprecedented stressors going on between COVID, the economic downturn, protests, tremendous uncertainty, as we've discussed. Personal demands are changing dramatically. Professional demands are changing dramatically. I think a lot of people are starting to wonder, how do we know when we're starting to become burned out? What do we look for? And how do we start to care for ourselves if we start to be concerned about burnout?
Yeah, this is such an important question. And the idea of kind of this juggling or balancing act is, I think, really on target. So burnout is really kind of an imbalance between a desire to succeed and a person's well-being. It really describes the consequences of chronic stress and really being unable to meet the constant demands that are placed upon you. So it's really characterized by things like emotional and physical exhaustion, feeling negative or cynical or distance from one's work, and reduced productivity. And people could feel irritable or overwhelmed. They might have poor sleep or feel run down. People could lose empathy or patience with others and really have a decreased sense of accomplishment. Really, there's more of a focus on work and neglect of someone's own needs. And people may also, in kind of efforts to cope, maybe using more alcohol or tobacco or drugs, which may be counterproductive. Now, most of us are working from home now, and while there's a lot of benefits to doing that, it also poses a lot of challenges when you talk about like work-life balance. It's so much harder to draw those clear boundaries when Like I am now, I'm working from my kitchen, or you're working from your bedroom. You're literally always at work, and having just more challenges in being able to concentrate and be productive, or the other end of the spectrum, kind of having trouble shutting down from working. If you're sharing space with other people, that could be challenging in terms of competing priorities. And if you're living alone, that isolation could kind of lead to those feelings of being burnt out. So what do you do if you start to experience any of these signs of burnout? I think for me, the first thing is really acknowledging what the experience is. Just kind of framing it and realizing it's okay. It's not a personal flaw. It's not a shortcoming or a sign of weakness. And then the second thing is really being able to do something about it. We know that it's kind of ignoring burnout could only make things worse and could lead to more serious kind of work productivity and performance issues, and also lead to signs of depression. So really being able to start with the basics of self-care. I think sometimes we forget just how powerful those basics are. So being able to make sure you're eating healthy food, staying hydrated, getting enough sleep, really helps us to feel more grounded. And then being able to develop coping strategies that work for you. And these are really tailored to each person. So, things that Danielle was talking about too, to combat anxiety, things like getting outside or exercising, being able to stay connected to other people is really important. It may also entail managing media consumption. I learned a new phrase, like doom scrolling, where people are just kind of scrolling through 24/7 media, which, you want to be able to stay informed without increasing that feeling of being overwhelmed. And then you also want to make sure that you're taking a look at your work routine. So that's kind of after the basics, being able to look at that, trying to create clearer boundaries between work and home, building in breaks and lunch, talking to your managers and working on prioritization, and then taking time off from work. I know that the landscape of vacation has totally shifted, but really being able to take time away in ways that kind of work for you. And just one other thing, just thinking about tips for managers. So what do you do if you kind of note that people who you're managing may be experiencing burnout, or even colleagues that you work with? So really being able to be a sounding board for support, helping people to prioritize, and modeling more balanced behavior, encouraging time off, and really being able to remind people of resources that are available to you and provided at your company. I mean, I know at Quartet, we're a really mission-driven mental health company, so we really take seriously providing a lot of supports for staff, and additionally making sure that people are aware of mental health supports that are available through your company that could really help.
Perfect. And Danielle, I know we're all facing different types of stresses right now with varying degrees of impact. One of the sources of stress, I think, for a lot of people is race-based stress, with the rise of tension around recent tragedies, greater visibility into racial injustice. This is a twofer, but how does discrimination and racism affect mental health? And what are some ways that people of color in particular can cope?
Yeah, I really appreciate that you're asking the question from this perspective and understanding that, like, whether it's COVID's impact on, in terms of the racial discrimination that was targeted specifically at the Asian community, as well as COVID's impact on the disproportionate effect that it's having on Black and Brown communities, or police brutality, that it's something that we are all being impacted by that, even if we do not necessarily identify with these communities specifically. Like, we're all being impacted when one of these things happens to someone else that we know or care about. It's just that, yes, race-based discrimination and trauma, when you are directly being impacted by it, it's just a different degree that you might be having a response, like I think it's normal for all of us to have a response to look at these things and have a response of like numbness, anger, grief, being overwhelmed, feeling exhausted, hopeless. It's just that the way that those things manifest look different depending on who's being impacted by what and in which community you do identify with and the degree to which you're experiencing it. So I just really appreciate that you're acknowledging that like all of us are having a reaction to what's happening right now. It's just certain communities are having one that is just different in terms of degree and maybe the way it shows up. And so I guess I kind of just highlighted there in that just like how communities of color can be impacted by racial and discrimination and trauma, mainly because the range of it. So it can be, we're looking at systemic racism all the way to very interpersonal, direct forms of racism that are happening. And so I think it's always important, maybe for those who do identify with the community that is being targeted, that like, regardless if it's something that's happening to you directly, if it's something that you're witnessing happening on the news, if it's something that you're seeing happening that's on a systemic level, it's okay and very normal to have a response to that. So I don't want to not validate that, like, oh, it didn't happen to me directly as a Black person, so therefore I shouldn't have this sense of anger or numbness or grief. It didn't happen to me directly. That's just not the way that trauma always works. So anything that you're feeling right now in response to these things that are happening, anything that you're seeing happening in other marginalized communities, even if it's not your own, I just really want to validate that like all of these responses are valid and normal. In terms of what to do about the numbness and the anger and the grief and the overwhelm and the exhaustion, I think always the first part is, again, giving validation to yourself so that way you can give validation to others. But I think the first part of coping is just validating that something is happening right now and naming that something is happening and giving yourself space to allow whatever's happening to occur. And then I think the next step you can take after that, once you've acknowledged it and named what's happening, I think that there is maybe some power that I've heard just from communities that I associate with, clients that I've worked with, that like there is some power in knowledge and like knowing more about what is happening and being able to name that, like, that is racist, that is discrimination, this is racial trauma. So just being able to get a sense of power and control over like, this is what's happening, and getting a framework for what's happening. People have found some sense of like solace, I think, in that. And then the other thing too that I think is, in addition to like validating, naming, getting some knowledge around what's happening, is also then connecting. So making sure that like you're not intaking all of this knowledge by yourself and like not talking with other people about like, what do you think about this, and gaining other perspectives, but also just connecting with other people in your community to like be there for each other, to validate that like, I'm numb too, I'm angry too, I'm grieving as well. Here's how I'm coping. Just the power of human connection and all of this, I think, is huge and a huge part of coping. And that's why we have communities, because I think it's powerful to connect with each other. So I think there's other ways, but I would say that those are probably just three if we want to stick to that. So validating, gaining some knowledge, and then connecting with others in your community around the experience.
I think those are great thoughts. And Joe, maybe could you build a little bit for us on how people outside of communities of color who aren't feeling the direct impacts of racism, I suppose, might better support those who are more directly impacted? And in that same vein, what does it look like to be an ally?
Yeah, I think one of the very, very few silver linings to come from the tragedies that put a long needed spotlight on racial injustice has been the momentum around allyship. And in talking with a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Andrea Holman, she's a professor and scholar on Black psychology, we talk about what it means to be an ally and what that looks like, and very practically how you take steps towards it. And she really emphasizes the need to first do the internal work. And I think that's spot on. And before you can take actions to support others, you need to better understand what your own biases are and the ways in which you may be behaving with good or benign intentions, but potentially inflicting harm. So that internal work means reflecting on your own identities and privilege. The idea of privilege is this unearned advantage that you have simply by virtue of being able-bodied, for example, or being in the majority, whether that's around race or sexual orientation. And by reflecting on your own identities and your privilege, you can hopefully better understand your blind spots and recognize that these blind spots aren't only shaped by race, they're shaped by so many different aspects of us that are informed by how we're socialized and how we interact with the world. And then once you get to know your blind spots and you better know yourself and you feel like you're doing the internal work, then combine that self-work with education and do the work to educate yourself about things like systemic racism and the history of it and how it manifests today and what the effects look like, and what the effects look like not only for the people who are directly impacted by it, but also, how are people benefiting from this structure and how can you take action to counter that? And there's lots of resources out there right now around anti-racism books. How to be an anti-racist is one of the most popular, and I think one of the most poignant in speaking to this moment. Podcasts, webinars. At Lyra, we offer a free webinar on this topic available on our website. Then with the education, the next step is taking action and being an ally through your behaviors, doing things like supporting minority-owned businesses, donating to relevant causes, being politically attuned to a candidate's positions on racial justice and voting accordingly. And of course, speaking up when someone expresses something that has that comes from a racist perspective or has an impact on someone from a community of color, a negative impact. And lastly, I'll just say, recognizing that all of these things are a continuous effort. There is no end point in this journey. It's ongoing. So the best thing that you can do is keep this at the forefront of your mind and keep it at the forefront of your conversations as an ongoing topic of dialogue, and recognizing this is continuous self-improvement, continuous dialogue, and the work both internally and externally to support what's right. It will be long lasting.
Thank you. Sherry, I think another thing a lot of people are experiencing around current events is feelings of sadness or depression. One thing that I certainly hear as a psychiatrist is that people have a lot of trouble distinguishing what's normal sadness, normal grief, as opposed to clinical depression, and what are some signs that somebody might actually need professional support?
Yeah, there's been a lot written and there's a lot of discussion around this pervasive feeling of grief right now due to the wide variety of losses that we've all been experiencing. Loss of social contact and normal routine, loss of control that we talked about before, deep concerns about people's health, economic losses. There's loss of life due to the virus, as well as loss of life due to racial violence. And most people affected by a crisis do experience psychological distress, so a normal response to crisis. And this typically includes things like sadness and confusion, fear and helplessness, and sleep disruption. And this typically will resolve over time. It's normal reactions and will resolve without intervention. But we know from clinical research that incidence of clinical depression can double during times of crisis. So in terms of clinical depression's the second most common mental health condition in the United States. It affects just over 7% of the population. Worldwide, it's the leading cause of disability. And under current conditions, we know that these numbers are going to be increasing. Some people refer to mental health tsunami, kind of in response and following the kind of global health pandemic, the physical aspects of it. In terms of symptoms of clinical depression, it's really a constellation of symptoms that includes sadness, fearfulness, tearfulness, changes in sleep or appetite, difficulty concentrating and making decisions. There's loss of energy and motivation, lack of interest in activities that once people found enjoyable, hopelessness. Some people feel guilt. There could be decreased activity, or on the other side of the coin, kind of agitation. And some people may experience suicidal thoughts or engage in self-harm behaviors. We know that depression often exhibits itself as physical symptoms, so aches and pains or fatigue, and it could commonly occur with anxiety symptoms or substance use. So with respect to what really distinguishes this more normal kind of distress response to crisis to clinical depression, it's really a matter of three things. So it's a matter of length of symptoms, degree, and then impact. So in order to make a diagnosis of clinical depression, symptoms typically have to last at least 2 weeks. They have to lead to significant distress. So that's the kind of degree. The people who are experiencing the symptoms are really distressed by what they're experiencing. And then it's really similar to when we were talking about anxiety. It's really impacting someone's functioning. So their ability to cope and function either at work or school, in their home responsibilities, or in relationships. So in terms of when to seek professional help, most certainly if symptoms begin to progress to a more clinical picture of depression, longer lasting symptoms impacting functioning, I really encourage people then to seek professional support, therapy, see a psychiatrist, whatever people could kind of access and kind of works for them to be able to ameliorate some of the symptoms they're experiencing. But even with a normal grief reaction, there's a lot going on, a lot of current stress. It's really, really important that people reach out to people in their lives. Being able to talk with people about this shared emotional experience, just to make sure that people are realizing they're not kind of in their feelings alone, and really being able to have meaningful discussions about what's going on with them could really help people with coping.
Perfect. Danielle, another topic that we've been hearing a lot about is sleep, and that is particularly important right now. We know that issues with sleep are linked to mental health challenges. And how do you think we can prioritize sleep and make sure that we're getting better quality sleep?
Yeah, no, that's definitely true that it is something that happens across mental health conditions. Sleep is just something that is going to be probably impacted for most folks. I actually find that it's also the first symptom that people can notice. And it's a lot of times the first symptom that sometimes bring people into therapy. They're just like, I cannot sleep and I've got to get a grip on this. And usually what I'll work with clients in therapy around sleep is like, yes, one component of that is definitely going to be some very tangible things that you can do around sleep. But a lot of the stuff is things that you could probably just Google, and some tips will come up around sleep. Like, just make sure you're getting 7 to 8 hours. That can really range for different people, but 7 to 8 hours typically is how much you need to sleep. Just other things of like making sure that like you're not on your phone while you're laying in bed, like try to do like have a wind down routine. So there's some very just like concrete behavioral activities that you can do to really help improve your sleep. But I find that in therapy, that's one small component of it, because the other thing that we often don't think about is that sometimes just the beliefs and the thoughts that we have around sleep can actually be the very thing that's playing a huge role in why we're not getting any sleep. So if you're laying in bed and kind of thinking to yourself, oh, I should be sleeping. If you're looking at your phone and being like, it is 3 a.m., I have to get up at 6, I have all these things that I need to do. Like that in and of itself, and that worry that's happening about the fact that you're not getting any sleep is keeping the mind extremely alert. And that's the thing that you don't want to do whenever you want to get to sleep. That's why they always make suggestions about having a wind down routine, because yes, it's about also getting your body to wind down, but also your mind to slow down and just relax. That's one thing that's kind of needed to just kind of get you in a place of going to sleep. Some other things to also consider too, that we talk about in therapy is like even some of the conditioning that happens around sleep. So Sherry, you mentioned and made a great point about how like it's also the very thing that's causing burnout, is this whole idea that like you're in your kitchen right now and it's really hard to like turn it off in terms of when you're not working. The same thing happens in terms of sleep. If you are in a place where your work life is now also happening in your bedroom, and there are other things that you're doing in your bedroom that don't have anything to do with sleep, then in some ways you could also conditioned your mind and body to respond that like, oh, we're in bed, yes, but that also may mean that this is the time for us to do work because you've done work in your bed all day. So it's really hard. And a part of it is also like doing that conditioning of just like, well, are there other places that you can do work in and really have your bed only be a place, or your room only be the place where like you wind down. Your body has the reaction when you walk into the room that like, oh, it's time to relax. And some of that is just like basic conditioning. Other things too is that like that we do in therapy is just addressing some of the myths that happen around therapy. So like one common myth is just that like there's this idea that like you can catch up on sleep, that like, okay, well, if I got 4 hours on Sunday, I'll just sleep 10 hours, you know, like the next day or whatever, and I'll try to like catch up for that lack of sleep that I got on Sunday. And it doesn't work like that. It's really more of, can we just get you in bed at a certain time and have you waking up at a certain time? And then we'll work on trying to get that happening a lot longer, where like, so I'll work with people around like, okay, so when you wake up, just get out of bed. Don't try to stay in bed and try to get to sleep. Let's keep your bedtime at the same time, regardless of what's going on. And even if you're really tired, we're waking you up at 6 o'clock. And eventually your body will over time just get used to that. I go to bed at this time and I wake up at this time. But the idea of trying to catch up on that, it just doesn't happen. So it's kind of like when you don't get a good night's sleep, it's just that you didn't get a good night's sleep. And we're going to just have to work on that for the next night to try to get you the 7 to 8 hours. So that's just one myth. So a lot of it is also just like addressing some of these myths that people have about sleep and just kind of correcting that. So that way they can be open to doing some of the change, like engaging in the changes that need to happen.
Perfect. And Sherry, another thing that affects all of our well-being is social connectivity. Working at home, sheltering in place means that a lot of us have had a lot less social contact with many people, our family, our friends. How do you think people can stay connected even as they socially distance for public health's sake?
Yeah, this is really challenging. I know that so many people are reporting feeling disconnected just because of all of the restrictions on all of our social interactions right now. We're just living in such a different world. And it really has a big impact, I think, on people's quality of life. I mean, I do want to acknowledge that there's definitely a range of comfort that people have with social interaction and kind of how social people are. But overall, I think being socially connected in meaningful ways is a key to health and well-being. So it's not so much the quantity of social connectivity, but it's really quality of how connected you are to others. It really helps people feel supported and really helps with coping. So now with the coronavirus pandemic. So more people than ever experiencing loneliness. There are some recent studies that show that loneliness has increased 20 to 30%. And social isolation, we know, could lead to increases in mental health concerns, things like PTSD, substance use, and domestic violence. But there's a real growing body of research that shows that it also has a real impact on physical health outcomes. So things like elevated blood pressure, poor sleep, and we keep coming back to sleep, declines in cognitive performance, and increased mortality risk from both acute physical health problems as well as chronic illness. So we know that older adults are much more at risk for social isolation, and this could further compromise their ability to fight off infections. So it's really concerning during a health pandemic. We want people's immune systems and functioning to be as strong as possible. There's also economic impact of loneliness. So in studies, social isolation has been linked to greater workplace absenteeism. Ooh, sorry, my dog. Lower productivity and lower quality of work. I think that the thing to remember is that social distancing doesn't have to mean social isolation. Just using and shifting the phrasing to physical distancing, which really more accurately describes public health efforts to kind of reduce viral spread, but really allows for social connections. But we definitely do have to do more than change the nomenclature, right? So we have to really make efforts to stay connected, and really making a point to build it into our daily routines in a very planned way, because it's not going to happen just on its own. So even just 15 minutes a day could make all the difference. So again, not quantity, but just like the quality of planned meetings, whether it be phone or video calls or texting. I know that people are talking about Zoom fatigue. So finding other ways, if Zoom isn't your cup of tea for social interaction, being able to find it in other ways. Old school letters, physically distanced walks or meetings with other people. Doing volunteer work is a great way to kind of step outside of yourself and be able to kind of connect with others and also help others to connect. So there's a lot of companies that are doing really interesting things to be able to reach out and chat with people who may be socially isolated, or to teach older adults how to better feel comfortable and better use technology so they can connect with other people. I have a giant dog, so pets are really helpful. I think pet adoption has increased during this time because it helps people to feel less lonely. Telehealth for mental health services are definitely another way that people could feel less isolated. This is kind of a silver lining for access to mental health services. So being able to access mental health has never been easier with a lot of the changes made to telehealth regulations. So being able to stay connected, even if it's with a professional, is really important. And not only reaching out for ourselves, but to those in our lives, in our communities that we are concerned about, that we think, maybe they may be feeling isolated or disconnected, to be able to reach out to others in our community so that we're all kind of keeping ourselves supported and feeling healthy.
And Joe, other side of the coin, some of us might live alone, be more socially isolated. Others of us might actually have more social contact than usual, especially with a few people that we live with, whether that's partners or families or roommates. What challenges can we expect in the other scenario from social isolation, where relationships are strained, and how do we overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, it's a good question. I relate to this personally. I moved in with my partner a month before the coronavirus pandemic really got started. So this has been a trial by fire for us. Luckily, it's worked out well. But along the way, we've experienced some of the increased risk of conflict and tension, even if not on a big scale, little small things. So first, it's just recognizing the added stress of the situation is affecting all of us individually. And that increased tension and frustration and stress that we feel individually then manifests in our interpersonal relationships. And that leads to increased risk of conflict, which frays those relationships. One of the main reasons why we have a greater risk for conflict is that we're often biased towards negative assumptions, including negative assumptions about other people's behavior. And so when you're cooped up with people in close quarters for long stretches of time, the little behaviors that people engage in start to feel like slights in your direction. And so it's easy for us to make assumptions that someone's behavior is directed at us, or someone's acting in a way that is ignoring our needs, or purposefully minimizing our needs, or doing something to marginalize us. So it's important to first check your assumptions. When someone does something that frustrates you or bothers you, before you react, pause and try to get a handle on what assumption am I operating under here as to why this person is behaving this way? And is it possible that I'm running away with a negative assumption that they're acting towards me personally when they may be behaving for some other reason? So making sure you're not taking things personally that aren't personal. Next, making sure you're taking responsibility for the things that are on you. So using I statements when you have frustrations with a partner or family member, instead of blaming and saying, you're doing this, you're affecting me in this way, you're the problem, try flipping it and saying, I feel this way when I perceive that you're doing this, and I experience these consequences in this way, and I'm wondering if I can get your help in addressing the problem. That's you taking ownership for your feelings and the role that you play in this. And it's very disarming. It helps people to be less defensive when you're trying to agree on a behavior shift. Then the last thing I'll say is when we're in close quarters with loved ones for long stretches of time, we're often noticing the behaviors that bother us, but letting go the behaviors that are positive. So try to flip that, engender more positive emotion in your relationships by looking for opportunities to praise. What is your partner or your child or your family member at home doing that you really appreciate? How can you express gratitude? How can you take the opportunity to praise the behaviors that you're seeing that are beneficial? And by doing so, not only are you creating more positive emotions, but you may be shaping their behavior so that they're doing more of the things that you like. So, I would just say, check your assumptions, use I statements, and look for opportunities to praise. And hopefully that helps mitigate the conflict and keeps everybody sane in the household.
Sherry, another one that hits close to home for me is that parents are facing particular challenges right now. One of the many hats people have to wear newly is that they need to be a teacher at times. What can help parents navigate these different roles all at once, and especially if they're feeling overwhelmed or start to become impatient?
Oh, wow. So this really resonates for me too. So I'm a parent as well, and disclosure. So I have a 12-year-old son. He did virtual school for 3 months. All of his camps were canceled. We're working out what the school scenario is going to look like in the fall. It could be like a hybrid model in which he would go back to school 2 days a week and be virtual the rest. Or depending on what happens, gearing up for like the full virtual school scenario. And I know that schools across the country are really working out what their plans are. So this for parents is inherently challenging, kind of not knowing. I think part of parenting is planning and schedules, and at least for me. So this is even more challenging. So as a parent of a 12-year-old, he has more independence. He's able to kind of negotiate some of these things on his own. But for parents of younger children, or parents of multiple children, or parents who have kids who have disabilities, this is even more challenging to be kind of sitting with and negotiating virtual school scenarios, which, you know, have a range of how involved and how robust they are, a range of how robust your kind of setup is to be able to have connectivity and all the technology you need to be able to do that. It just makes it really challenging. For parents who are single parents, for parents who have to show up at work in the community and aren't able to work from home, exponentially more challenging. I could loop back to that conversation about burnout, all the things we were talking about, because it really sets the stage for a lot of stress. You know, parents trying to help school their kids while trying to be productive at work is really hard. There was a recent New York Times article that said something like, in the COVID-19 economy, you could either have a job or a child, but you can't have both. So I think that for me really is the essence of the challenge that parents are facing. And we know that the current context really magnifies pre-existing disparities. So in terms of options and parents' ability to kind of be more creative around what their options are, not everyone has the same options. So now to get to the response of like, so what do parents do? And I wish I had like the silver bullet for this. So I think for me, there's three things that I kind of think about. And, you know, the first is really dealing with the emotional aspect of it. So just wanting to validate and normalize the struggle, first of all. It's okay and normal to feel overwhelmed with all of this. I think about that old saying of kind of putting on your own oxygen mask before you help others. Sometimes that helps in being able to think about all of your own self-care so that you're better able to care for your kids. I think you also have to take a look at and kind of change the lens a little bit on how you view parenting. So getting more comfortable with kind of being a good enough parent and not being so hard on yourself for, you know, those kind of lines that we all draw in the sand that we've had to kind of, you know, smooth over and step over. I know that, you know, we've been having a lot more screen time. Fortnite is played in my house much more than it used to be at these points. And whatever it is for you, whether it be screen time or meals or just something that things are different. And being able to acknowledge, I think, your situation and the efforts that you are making and that you're doing the best that you can. So the second part for me is managing the logistics. And I think this part is the hardest. I think just realizing that it's okay and even necessary to ask for help. So from partners, from family members, from friends, from other parents, being able to talk to managers at work and using your community, even if it's just for emotional support. I think now more than ever that phrase of it takes a village to raise children, I think is really true, except now we're wearing masks to do it. You really want to also be able to maintain some kind of semblance of a schedule or routine for kids. I think it's important for us as adults, but for children, it's also, I think, even more important. Helping them with their self-care and creating room for them for fun and for play. And then for me, the third thing is just helping our kids to understand and make sense of what's going on in the world. How do they understand coronavirus? How do they understand racial injustice? How does it impact their families and themselves? I think when you come down to it, kids miss their friends. And they might not admit it, but I really think that they miss school too. They might be feeling more isolated, they're bored, there's a lot of disappointments that they're experiencing. And we need to help our kids be able to form some kind of narrative around their experience. I think we need to allow them to ask questions, and we need to be able to give them honest and age-appropriate responses. It could be helpful to talk with other parents, get advice from pediatricians or teachers, just to be able to find language and things that work for you. There's a lot of resources online as well. But I think the most important thing is just finding something that works for you and your kids and your family.
Perfect. And Danielle, another hat that some of us wear is being somebody's son or daughter. And I think many of the people on this call have elderly parents that are in a vulnerable population for COVID-19. Many of us are worried about them. Maybe we are more worried about them than they are about themselves. What do we do in this situation to encourage our parents to be more responsible? And what can I do to manage my worry about them?
Yes, I too am in that category. And definitely, I guess in answering this question, I can definitely talk about just my own personal process. So I actually think that the first part would be answering the question of like, what can I do to manage my own worry about them? I think is actually the first part of like, before we get to a point of, well, I need to encourage them to be more responsible. The first thing is like, let me manage my own concern about them and worry about them, because I think that that is definitely going to shape the way in which I want to encourage them. And I really like that we use the word encourage as well. But so one is in terms of how can we manage our own worry about our parents, is just one, again, validating that like the worry, the frustration is valid and real, and you're not alone in that worry and that frustration. I think something that's also helpful is to acknowledge, or at least it's been helpful for me, is that I'm acknowledging in those moments when I do worry and I'm having some frustration about my parents, I'm like, this is coming out of a place of care and concern. And reminding myself that like, it is because I care about them and I care about their safety that I'm worried and a bit frustrated that, you know, maybe they're not having the same kind of response that I'm having. So I think knowing that like the place that I'm coming from is out of concern has helped in terms of how I go about encouraging my parents to engage in some different behaviors that I think could keep them safe, right? So I think also that process is giving you space to acknowledge like there's limits to my control. So yes, I'm coming from a place of care and concern, and also my care and concern can't necessarily change their behavior. And my care and concern can do things like maybe provide them some knowledge around like, look, I'm sharing this with you because I care about you. And here's something that I learned. I'm passing it along. Like if they say that if you engage in this particular behavior, like it's a safe behavior for yourself and others. And so it's also just a way of just like assertively expressing the desires and the wants. So going back to Joe's point about using I statements, that like acknowledging that like I care about you. I really want this for you. It would be great, I think, if you would engage in this behavior or try this new thing, and just leaving it at that. Because really assertive communication is just about respecting you and the other person in the interaction. And so if you can assertively say what you want while also respecting their autonomy as humans and individuals in the world that can make decisions for themselves, I think that that's really the balance, and it's just accepting a lot of acceptance.
Perfect. We're getting towards time here. So Joe, I think this is going to be our last question. People are talking a lot about the importance of resilience, especially as we get used to this new normal with social distancing, working from home. Can you explain how resilience is applicable in the current situation and some tips for building it?
Sure. I'll try to answer quickly. Resilience, first of all, I just want to say what it's not. It's not a cure-all. It's not a reason to absolve situations and systems from blame. So sometimes you hear, well, if someone was just more resilient, they would be able to deal with the situation better, or they wouldn't have such negative effects from what's going on. Resilience doesn't absolve responsibility from the things that cause negative mental health effects. But that being said, resilience can be a really powerful buffer against some negative mental health effects, and it's learnable. It's basically a set of behaviors that help you to cope more effectively and bounce back from setbacks. And there are lots of different behaviors that help you to be more resilient. A few that stand out as being especially relevant right now. One is self-compassion. We have a lot of research to show that when people face setbacks, they often engage in self-criticism. And we have this belief in the back of our heads that if I criticize myself enough, it'll push me to do better, that it's a motivator. But all the research contradicts that. Self-criticism essentially leads to people becoming demotivated and deciding, well, if I'm not good enough, then why even try? So self-criticism is not the right approach after a setback. Instead, show yourself the kind of kindness and compassion you would show to a friend or family member who was facing a setback. Show that to yourself. Also, optimism. And that doesn't mean thinking Pollyanna and overly positive. It means thinking more realistically. So making sure you're not running away with catastrophic fears about the future and telling yourself it's extremely likely that all of these negative things are going to happen. Try to rein that in, think more realistically, focus on what is within your control. And then lastly, social support is one of the strongest predictors of good mental health. So making sure that you're reaching out, you're socializing, you're asking for help when you need it, and you're asking for specific kinds of help from the people that are best positioned to provide that help. If you need an empathetic listener, go to someone who you trust to be empathetic. If you need someone for good advice, go to someone that you respect. And then if you need someone who can provide some kind of concrete help or support, go to the person who has that resource and make sure to ask them for the specific thing that you want, so you set them up to best help you. There's a lot more I could say on that, but I think that's a hopefully helpful primer on resilience.
That's perfect, Joe. I think we're at the hour. I just want to thank you very much to our panelists for being so thoughtful and giving such great advice. And thank you so much for everybody for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks for having us. Y'all take care.
Bye.
Bye.